Good day to you from Anagalactic on the 24th day of August. Over here, you'll see our famous mascot, really the mascot of the whole Earth, since it's lingering in an orbit around the Earth. That is the moon. It certainly looks like a circle, and that is the beginning of geometry. From one aspect, geometry can be approached in a number of ways, but when you begin by looking at the moon, if you're actually beginning there, then your geometry is rather obvious. You have a circle. A circle is a planar object. It exists only on a plane because that is where you draw it. So it exists in a superspace called the plane. So the circle is a member of a superspace called the plane. Well, then you would want to define the plane, and you know that you're now entering into a regression. So let's define the plane just so we can start the regression. Where is the plane? The plane is in a superspace. So this is a pattern that you have to put your space into a superspace. So where does the plane exist? According to a framework approach, you could now continue in one of two ways. And this is the beginning of sacred geometry according to my approach. So there is our germinal definition using a single example of what might be called sacred geometry. In our previous video to kick off this series, we examined the two words, sacred and geometry. The first word, sacred, is a qualifier called an adjective. So it's a characteristic or property or attribute of geometry. So what is that? Another regression. So when you say geometry, you're putting it into some kind of class, which is an organizational and hierarchically organizational scheme of using words logically. So what is geometry? It must fit into a class, which is a nominative superspace. So, so now we have two threads going in our definitional basis, which I say is required according to the Polya method of problem solving. You need your definitions first, because you need to know what you're talking about before you can either describe it or explain it. You have to know what your terms are, your words. Your units of communication are words. So this is all symbolic. It occurs in the human mind. But the moon does not occur in the human mind. Does it or doesn't it? That's actually quite a philosophical question. So now we have three threads going. And this is what I call the adumbration of the regressive method of science to get basis orientation. You have to know what you're doing. You have to have a system. The word system is an extremely important word to know what that means. So system is another word we would like to introduce in our approach to sacred geometry, whatever that might mean, whatever that might be, if it has some substantial meaning. I say that it does. However, you would be hard-pressed, as I have been hard-pressed, to define what might be meant by that. Is it a useful term? Sacred is rather an extruded word from some other realm where you're now ordering things, that is, ideas, according to sacredness. Let me just give you a synonym for sacredness: holiness. What does that mean? What is intended by the word holy or sacred is that it is reserved in some way. In other words, it's special. Now, we take note of that in rational logic because that's something you would want to glom onto right away if there is a special case, because now you're limiting your field. That is the very basis of defining something. So what is intended by sacred? I would say that the word special might be better because it doesn't invoke a religious concept. Holiness is generally associated with deity or something that is in heaven, not on earth. That would be one possible way of defining the word sacred. It's somehow beyond the norm. So sacred is special. I would say you could use the word reserved or special. Peculiar is the idea involved, but it's not that it's peculiar, although it's peculiar relatively to what is common. It's uncommon. Now, I would like to just give you an example of what might be meant. I did not invent this word, and I don't normally use it outside of its normal scope would be in religious dialogue, where the word sacred has a more common meaning. In other words, it's more accessible. It has a relatively useful meaning in religion because you're defining the difference between heaven and earth in some abstract way. But sacred does not normally occur in physics. It's not a qualifier. We don't have, sacred particles, although the Higgs boson was kind of touted as being sacred because we are religiously oriented and we can always invoke that side of us. But in physics, it's generally considered to be unwelcome because you're introducing more or less subjective factors in your use of words. But the very idea of subjectivity is that it's limited to one person. Subjective means it's your own. It's not really shared. Objective means it is shared. It's out in the universe. Well, that's the province of science. So subjectivity, by definition, is outside the province of science. That's virtually tautological in the definition of science, is that it's not subjective. But the word sacred is subjective. So it needs translation. I've endeavored to do so because sacred geometry, I just want to show you something here. This is a book that I acquired. Let me just get this moon. Let's get our moon out of the way. We'll turn off the portal so I can show you this. It's a very captivating cover. You see that we have the author, Robert Lawler, who did a very good job. This is a good book. And it says right in the title, Philosophy and Practice. Well, practice, of course, is something we all can identify with, but philosophy, there is such a thing as the philosophy of science. So you could say that geometry is a province of philosophy if you enjoy that sort of classificational approach. I do agree that philosophy is part of science. It's at the highest level. It's when you're done doing science and now you need to interpret what you've discovered. You have understanding from physics. It now needs to be applied to humans. And that's where philosophy enters in. How does physics improve a human being? Quite a philosophical statement or question, which of course we are perforce answering by our very action. Why are you listening to me? It's because you're a scientist. So you have a goal. You may not be able to define that goal. That's actually quite a difficult thing to do. What is the purpose of science for you? Well, you alone could answer that. It's a subjective answer because you have a feeling system that evaluates what's good for you. In order to evaluate what is good about science, you're using the word good. That's subjective. What's good about science? For you. Now you can project that onto humanity. And thereby you acquire a system of investigation. What have other men thought about the applicability of science to humanity? Which means you. Or in my case, it means me. But for anybody, it means him or her. So, what is the value of science for humans? Well, I believe that my first answer, against my will, but it still is my first answer, is technology. What's wrong with saying that? Do you know? Have you ever thought about what is technology in relation to what we're talking about, which is essentially geometry? What would be sacred about science? Is there such a thing as sacred science? By analogy, there would have to be. If there's such a thing as sacred geometry, there must be such a thing as sacred science. Well, that's much easier to identify because that would be the goal of science. That would be sacred because we want it. We want it, but we can't get it. So it's sacred. It means it's special. It's beyond the reach of man. Now, science is a process, you could easily say, of breaking that barrier. We would dearly love to know how to harness energy to create indoor lighting. If somebody had this idea 2,000 years ago, my goodness, it sure would be nice to illuminate the interior of our dwellings with artificial light. We've been using torches, we've been using candles, we've been using incandescent material to illuminate some kind of a perhaps blown glass bulb to make a light source for the interior of our homes. Well, that is a certainly desirable goal. Otherwise, you can't read after the sun goes down because you have no light. So that's a very practical goal. And 2,000 years ago, whoever might have thought of such a thing might have racked their brain. How can I get light into my home? Well, in the late 19th century, some discoveries were made in science on how to harness electricity, which is stored energy. So you're using electrical currents in order to generate a motive force through a channel called a wire of electronic pressure so that it reaches a bulb where now you have two wires that are very close, but there's a gap. And it may be microscopic, they may actually touch, but there's still gaps between the molecules through which electrons are flowing. That's called electricity. And you know the result: indoor lighting. That's sacred. That is sacred because it's a miracle. It's a miracle of nature that man discovered. That's sacred. Man discovered the use of electricity, and now we have interior lighting. We even have exterior lighting, which is quite a subject of debate, because, of course, light pollution ruins astronomy. It interferes with the use of the telescope, which is very sacred. So we have suddenly a valid use of the word sacred once we interpret it as goal orientation. Goal orientation is toward the sacred. That's what we want. But we don't know what it is. So it's mysterious. And that becomes, of course, spooky. How do you know what it is that you haven't yet discovered? What a question. Perhaps we have more miracles awaiting discovery, such as space travel. Well, we've partially penetrated even that veil. So the sacredness of physics is now well known, and it's called technology. It's called technology. And now I want to tell you, point blank, so that we are all on the same page here, technology is an offshoot of science. It's a branch of science. Technology is not science itself. It is not the ultimate goal of science. And here's why. Once you have interior lighting through the use of the miracle of electricity, the miracle, because we did not know it existed and we discovered it, that means it's miraculous. And that goes to the supernatural, because who put that there to be discovered? And that is a special form of unary interrogative address using one of the 7 interrogatives: what, where, when, who, which, how, and why. Those are the 7 interrogatives. This is who, and there's only one: the designer. So that's religion bound into science. So science incorporates religion, because whatever we discover that is miraculous, such as electricity, must be attributed to a designer who left it there to be discovered. Such as, for instance, the very existence of the moon. That is a physical object that we can see. What does that have to do with sacred geometry? I think you can answer that question better than you could 10 minutes ago. Am I right? I hope so, because that was my purpose. What is sacred about the moon? It is, and I'm stating this now as you could say a postulate or a theorem. I won't say law, but I will say principle. Why is the moon a miraculous part of science? It is because it shows you a circle, and a circle is an unnatural shape. But now you see that I might be a little hasty in saying that it's unnatural. No, it's not unnatural. It's the most natural shape there is. And that is the discovery that I made 4.5 years ago, that the circle is the basis of everything. Of everything. It is the end of the recursive regression in defining the basis of science. You're looking at it. That is the sacred basis of science. It's a reserved, special, actually unique, miraculous revelation that there is a planar shape in the universe that we can see that is real. The circle is real. Now, what about the line? I've covered that. I've covered that over the past 2 weeks, and I've covered it over the past 4 years. What is the line? It is a planar object. So is the circle. You can see that there is a huge difference between the circle and the straight line. It's actually an extreme difference, but there is a relationship. In the definition of sacred geometry that in the last video we read from Wikipedia, it is repeated in the opening paragraphs of this book. Geometry is the study of spatial order. Geometry and arithmetic, together with astronomy, the science of temporal order through the observation of cyclic movement. I'm just going to stop there, because this introduces something that is not the circle. It is called the cycle, which has to do with motion, not geometry. Are they related? I have discovered the relationship between the circle and the cycle. And those are two absolutely opposite things in the physical sense. The moon, revealing the sacred shape called the circle, indicates its volume analog, the sphere. And you know that the moon is actually, that is physically, a sphere. But geometrically, it's a circle. There is a direct relationship between the sphere, the circle, and the line. And I discovered the mathematical relationship between those three fundamental objects, one of which is not planar. The line is a calculus derivative of the circle, as I'll be showing you. I've already shown you the proportional relationship between the circle and its diameter, which is a line. The mathematical fixed constant relationship between the distance of the diameter and the length of the circumference is pi, and that is an irrational number. So that is extremely significant. It was to the Greeks, and it still is to us today. The curvature is not straight. That seems obvious, but that is profound, because the circle is a line. But it's a special line called a closed line. And a circle, as you can see, has an interior. But this black region, I need my pointer here, this black region around the moon, that is the exterior of the circle. In volume space, that space around the sphere is external to the sphere. So the sphere has an internal space and an external space. And that is the introduction into sacred geometry of the concept of duality. And I discovered the mathematical definition of the relationship between the space outside the circle or the sphere, they're related, and the space inside the circle or sphere, that has a geometric relationship that you can see. It also has a mathematical relationship that I discovered. It's called conjugation. Conjugation. This is the introduction to sacred mathematics, which I discovered. And I also discovered sacred geometry. And that is the beginning. In our second video, in our introductory series to sacred geometry, to get the definition. I've got the definition, nobody else does. So I'll be showing you what is physical sacred geometry, as it applies to quantum mechanics and to astronomy, to astrophysics, cosmology, atomic and subatomic dynamic balance, and the nature of gravity and its role in the universe, and the nature of electromagnetic radiation and its role in the universal force balance that goes all the way down to the atom, and inside the atom to the nucleus, inside the nucleus to the proton, and inside the proton to the harmonic balance that establishes the relationship between gravity and light. That is the current goal of science. I've solved it. So that's what you're tuned in to hear. Through the veil, to get the truth, so that you know it, and can prove it, and can teach it. That alone is science. So I'll be teaching you sacred science, so that you will benefit from it palpably, tangibly, practically, pragmatically, and beyond. To whatever your personal goals are, you will now have more choices to achieve your goal than you ever had before. May you be blessed by the designer to achieve your goal that he wants you to achieve. That can be proved. He wants you to do this. Your designer has programmed you to know this. When it's time for you to know it, you will be able to, but only you can choose to understand. It cannot be forced. I cannot ram it down your throat. I cannot make you see. You have to want to. But if you do want to, you will be enabled. That's the law of the universe. We'll be right back. Keep looking up. We'll have more very shortly as we proceed very quickly through the tenets and axiomata of sacred geometry going to sacred mathematics. You mathematicians, you're about to be enlightened. This is what you wanted from mathematics. You'll never achieve it unless you listen to this, because I've got it and nobody else does. I'm wearing the robe. I came back from through the veil. I've got the truth, and it can be shared, and you can understand it. That's science. I've got it. And I'm writing a book and a paper, and I will be interviewed eventually, and I will go on tour, and I will be enlightening millions of people to the truth that sets you free through science, not religion. Science is the basis of religion. You will come to learn that. Thank you for tuning in. We'll be right back.